And hello, everyone. Welcome from wherever you're tuning from this evening, this afternoon, or this morning, wherever you are around the world. It's time once again for our online seminar series, The International Perspectives on Corpus Technology for Language Learning. This is now the 7th episode in this 3rd season now of our seminar series. And we're very pleased tonight, today, this morning, wherever you're tuning in from, to have our speaker, Professor Eric Friginal, who is Professor and Head of Department of English and Communication at the Hong Kong Polytechnic University in Hong Kong. And he's going to be talking today about using Corpora and English for professional communication, focusing on aeronautical English, which has been a research interest of Professor Friginal for some time now, and I've read a number of book chapters and papers dedicated to this topic, which is fascinating for me. I think one of my favorite TV shows is that show, Air Crash Investigators, right? And you see sometimes that a number of the crashes are caused by poor use of poor communication, issues with communication, and the aeronautical English is supposed to be a kind of standardized way of making sure that communication across multilingual, multicultural pilots, air traffic control, and so on is done in a way that can be understood and is unambiguous. And Professor Eric today is going to tell us about how he uses Corpora to investigate that language, that register, and possibly also to share some ideas about how we might go about teaching that and through the use of Corpora. Before we begin, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land or the online space, certainly in which we meet tonight, paying our respects to their ancestors and their descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connections to country, while, of course, we recognize their valuable contributions to Australian and global society. So let's introduce tonight's speaker. Eric is, as I already mentioned, is a full professor and head of Department of English and Communication at the Hong Kong Polytechnic University in Hong Kong. Before moving to Hong Kong, he was professor and director of international programs at the Department of Applied Linguistics and ESL at Georgia State University in Atlanta, Georgia. So quite a shift for him, but one that he is definitely enjoying, as he so reports. His recent publications include the Routledge Handbook of Corpus Approaches to Discourse Analysis with Jack Hardy, and Corpus Linguistics for English Teachers, New Tools, Online Resources, and Classroom Activities. And at the moment, Eric is the founding co-editor-in-chief of the journal Applied Corpus Linguistics, which is co-edited together with Paul Thompson, published by Elsevier, and is looking to be a promising outlet in the field of corpus linguistics and language education as well, more generally. So, Eric, it's a pleasure to have you on our seminar series tonight. Thanks so much for coming along. Let's hear what you've got to tell us about how you use Corpora for aeronautical English. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Peter, and thanks everybody for being here. I see a lot of familiar names and also some really special ones. I'm going to give a shout out to my good friend Pum, who I see from Thailand. Thank you, Pum, for joining me here, and also another good friend, Balila Prado, who I see here as well. So thanks everybody for joining me. Thanks to Peter and to Fran for inviting me. I'm honored. Happy to be part of now the 3rd season of this series. I've been following what's going on, and I'm happy to finally be part of the community. I hope everybody can hear me okay. Peter, you gave me a thumbs up. Everything's working well sound-wise and all that, right? So let me just go ahead and give another shout out to my colleagues at Georgia State University. A lot of the work that I'm doing and presenting, sharing with you was supported by my colleagues and my department at Georgia State in Atlanta. And I'd like to thank all of them over the years. I was there for 13 years and had fun with my colleagues and my students. So a hi to all of you, if some of you are from GSU listening right now. I studied corpus linguistics, and my corpus approach is coming from the works of my mentors. I studied under Doug Biber and Randy Ruppin, and my mentors and classmates and colleagues as well from Northern Arizona University. So that's where I am coming from when it comes to how I utilize corpus linguistics as a research approach across what I study, from the traditional, if you may, to the more specialized areas of research and applications that I have been looking at. I'm energized and enthusiastic by what's going on in the field of corpus linguistics in 2022, as you see here. It's been really fascinating. There are a lot of advancements. There are a lot of developments. The internet has helped us a lot when it comes to how we share data and Corpora and tools. However, this also is a little bit potentially, slightly, not really in a big way, but slightly problematic, because it's hard to articulate sometimes many of the overlaps. You know, for example, how do people distinguish corpus linguistics and computational linguistics? Or when people talk about language processing or natural language processing, what do they actually mean when they're also using Corpora, right? So I want us to continue looking at these kinds of things because, you know, these are all new and they are fascinating. But my argument is we have to really clearly articulate what we're doing. Are we working on corpus linguistics or not? It's very important to really articulate that and align what we're doing with the kind of research that came before us. So the right lit review, the right citation, and how we package the quantitative versus the qualitative and the interpretive side of what we're doing. So my default is to look at this definition, which was articulated in an article or actually a book chapter with Biber, Ruppin, and me from 2010, sharing that corpus linguistics is a research approach in the study of spoken and written discourse, supporting empirical frequency-based investigations of naturally occurring language and use. So I feel like there are a lot of things to unpack here, but one thing is clear, it's an approach, it's a research approach. It's looking at spoken and written discourse. It's empirical, it's frequency-based, and it's analyzing naturally occurring language in use. So there are a lot of overlapping ideas with sociolinguistics, with pragmatics, with other models that we have been working on in discourse analysis over the years. It's just a matter of properly aligning our definitions and our resources to argue for the right domain or field. You know, so we articulate the differences between what we're doing in corpus-based research and what our colleagues in natural language processing or computational linguistics, big data analytics are also doing. In the spirit of that, Peter mentioned this because, and it's great that he is also an editorial board member of this new journal. It's called Applied Corpus Linguistics with Paul Thompson from University of Birmingham as my co-editor-in-chief. I hope that many of you guys, if you're working on corpus-based data for teaching, for research, for many sides of application, that you'll consider submitting to our journal. We'd love to have you. So please make note of our journal. It's published by Elsevier. Again, you can just Google Applied Corpus Linguistics. We call it ACORP. And I hope to see your submissions very soon. In developing this presentation for today, and as I mentioned, I selected highlighting my work with aviation English. I actually was coming from a bigger area, you know, if you may, Peter mentioned earlier, English for specific purposes. I could say that that could be my umbrella area as well, right? But using Corpora in professional communication, real world interaction in the professional world or in the workplace. And one of the big goals is to examine what's going on, right? So frequency-based linguistic distributions from specialized corpora of English professional spoken communication. I have been lucky to now work at Hong Kong PolyU. I was influenced a lot by the work done here for, you know, from the early 2000s. Many of you in the audience are familiar with the works of Winnie Cheng and Martin Warren. at PolyU. They both have now retired from our department, but they have done a lot of work, again, with the Hong Kong corpus of spoken English. We have a research center for professional communication, and I really encourage you guys to visit our website. You can download many of the freely available corpora that we have been collecting over the years. Some of them are really fascinating. They could be based in Hong Kong, like the Hong Kong Financial Services Corpus or Hong Kong Policy Address Corpus, but they are comparable and could be something that you can utilize as a parallel corpus for something that you are collecting as well. So again, I'd like to invite you to check out the RCPCE and the collection of corpora that we have, and we are sharing freely for researchers all over the world. In terms of continuing with my goals and objectives for this talk, I'm energized by what Peter has identified as an area, international perspectives. This is also obviously where I'm coming from a lot when I study the domains of professional communication that I've been looking at. I come from the international side, if you may. I really emphasize the cultural structures. I emphasize potentially interactions between speakers whose first language may not be the same. So different L1s and L2s in utilizing a particular language. Obviously, my bias is English in workplace communication. So that's something that I wanted to share with you. I'm also following a model, a stage cycle for corpus-assisted discourse analyses. This has been influenced by the works of Paul Baker and many other colleagues who are into CADS or corpus-assisted discourse studies. But one thing that's very important in this type of model is articulating as well the qualitative side that's very much needed in our analyses, the interpretive techniques that is needed, and how you go into this iterative cycle where, hey, you might need a new research questions and you might need to go back to the data and process the data again. And then because I work with spoken discourse in the workplace, I also would like to incorporate some of the items that are not easily captured in corpus-based domains, right? So contributions from Pratt or Elan and other more qualitative in vivo type analyses that could be incorporated in how we further analyze the corpus that we have collected. And finally, I jump into what I will consider as the important contribution of research that I'm doing, the pedagogy side of it, and then the policy side of the data that I'm able to extract from the specialized corpora available to me, whether it's, again, aviation or call centers or maritime interaction or doctor-patient communication. I'm influenced by the work of Halt and also Stamper and King in how they defined language policy and planning. It's explicit and implicit at the same time, looking at the values and rights associated with languages, both macro and micro. We focus on understanding and the development of both top-down and bottom-up language policies, but also their implementation and impact at local, regional, and national levels. And this is what I wanted to share with you today as you reflect on potential language applications of how we analyze what's going on with pilot and air traffic controllers and other subdomains of aviation English. So corpora in the classroom, many of you are familiar with this side of it based on obviously the main theme of this series. And again, I commend Peter and all of the speakers in the previous presentations in sharing with us all the groundbreaking work that we have now been experiencing when it comes to teachers' use of corpora and materials design in the classroom. So with that in mind, I am wanting to take you guys into workplace communication, utilizing corpora and in analyzing what goes on, and then policy and potential teaching applications. And then I have identified, again, the domain of aviation communication. I'm not going to be spending a lot of time here, but we need to reference theory. I'm primarily in the dialectical approach of intercultural communication, following the works of Martin and Nakayama. So aviation, global aviation, or aeronautical communication. Some colleagues like Patricia Toskilux and Malila Prado have utilized the term aeronautical communication to refer to the language of pilots and air traffic controllers. It's within the bigger umbrella, if you may, of aviation English. The whole aviation domain obviously will be divided into subdomains, including the language of maintenance manuals or technical manuals as developed by our big airplane manufacturers globally, and utilized by different technicians all over the world. It could also be the language of ground crew or flight attendants. So many areas or subdomains where aviation is the key theme. I have collected over the years, worked with outsourced customer service, also international maritime communication, and various multicultural workplaces across different regions. In where you guys are neighbors with, the Wellington corpus of spoken New Zealand English. The works of Janet Holmes and Bernadette Fine have also influenced me a lot, and I'm a big fan of what they're doing. And so I'm looking at how their applications and those areas are actually related to the kinds of corporate and specialized data that I've collected over the years. I worked with augmentative and alternative communication workplace devices, with Lucy Pickering and Carrie Bruce. And I got into all of these things. I originally worked with call center outsourcing, call center communication in India and the Philippines, communicating with customers from the United States and various other countries. I came from the Philippines. I grew up there, and the Philippines is what has been called as the Manning capital of the world when it comes to maritime workers, seafarers, and globally serving multicultural and multinational industries all over the world. And you can also see the major parallels between this domain and aviation communication. This is from a site called Marine Traffic, and it tells you the traffic generally of ships all over the world moving from one port to another, which shows us a greater similarity with aviation communication. And again, if I isolate this presentation into the discourse of pilots and air traffic controller, you can see some similarities. So this is where we are right now with aviation communication, especially if I can use the term post-COVID. There is really a global major need for pilots in terms of recruitment, in terms of staffing. Boeing predicts that there will be 804,000 pilots needed in the next 15 years or so. 266,000 of them will be from the Asia Pacific region, with Hong Kong and the Greater Bay Area, and all the way to Australia and New Zealand. So there's really going to be a major need for pilots, international pilots traveling overseas. Here in Hong Kong, in my university, Hong Kong Polytechnic University has partnered with Cathay Pacific in re-energizing what they call a cadet pilot program, training pilots from this region both to fly and also communication. So it's a real need, and there is a real demand in improving communication. So that's where we come from. That's where we come in. I believe many of the participants in this presentation are not pilots, or maybe not ATCs. Maybe some of you are. Maybe some of you have done training, but many of us are language experts. I obviously am not a pilot, and I'm not also an air traffic controller, but I've learned over the years how to navigate the teaching and training and researching in this domain. I'm interested in the interaction between L1 and L2 speakers in this domain. I'm interested in looking at miscommunication and the occurrences of all these things related to sociolinguistic factors such as power, role hierarchies. Something that's really interesting is also the presence of assessment, that if you are an non-native speaker of English in these domains that have traditionally now been identified as primarily English-based, then you are assessed all the time. So I wanted to take a look at that. I wanted to see what's going on. In terms of policy, as I mentioned, aviation is monitored by the United Nations International Civil Aviation Organization, and maritime is also monitored by the International Maritime Organization, also with the United Nations. So there's something about it that will tell us that there's monitoring going on, and language by non-native speakers, the international people participating in this domain on a regular basis, are not identified as technically the safe speaker. And that's the reason why they have to be assessed almost all the time, really. And that's where many of us come in. So thank you to my colleagues at Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University. I learned a lot from them. They introduced me to this domain, particularly Elizabeth Matthews, who has been doing this for years and years and years. Dominique Estival from Western Sydney University has done a lot of work in this domain as well. And we have many organizations now. The International Civil Aviation English Association is a very dynamic, really, really productive group of teachers, practitioners, frontliners, and researchers. And I've been happy to be involved in the ICAO over the years. I believe we have many Brazilians in the group as well. So the JEA group in Brazil, Aeronautical English Research Group, they have been also very, very productive in looking at various studies and as well using corpora and corpus-based approaches. So I don't think I need to convince you all how important the domain is when it comes to safety, when it comes to business and travel. But there have been some fatal airplane crashes attributed to language difficulties over the years, and this is where we come from. Obviously, one fatal accident is one accident too many in this domain. All right, so many people have been studying this over the years using discourse analytic approach. What I'm talking right now will be how we look at this using corpus-based approach. There have been available corpora. So there's the Radio Telephony Plain English Corpus, or RTPEC, collected by Malila and Patricia. There's the Corpac collected by Aline Pacheco and many other colleagues as well. Many of these things, you can actually collect your own aviation corpus because many of the samples are available from BAS Aviation. You can just Google this, and they even have a YouTube channel. You can download many sound files and start collecting your own version of a specialized aviation or aeronautical communication corpus between pilots and air traffic controllers. You can work on coding them and looking at some primarily distinctions between the speakers, if you can identify where they're coming from or who they're affiliated with when it comes to their airlines. So one example that I'm going to share with you in this part now of this presentation is what do we do, right? So one example, think about this as one case study, analyzing politeness in aeronautical communication, right? So there could be a macro policy that I identify here, aviation as defined by ICAO. What are expectations by the International Civil Aviation Organization? What do they want? How do they want us to teach aviation language or aeronautical language, right? Micro language policies. What do we get from textbooks, and how do textbooks, classroom activities in aviation instruction identify politeness? So again, politeness could be in sociolinguistics, could be in pragmatics, but how are these taught? In micro language policies for many aviation textbooks, politeness actually is not encouraged. They're saying that this indirect language, so we should not be utilizing politeness markers or strategies. And there are many ways. Politeness is not part of phraseology. It's superfluous and unnecessary, detracting from conciseness in communication, all these kinds of linguistic distribution. So I did a multidimensional analysis following Biber's approach of the linguistic characteristics of what I consider polite discourse in the workplace. Many of you are familiar with MBA. I'm not going to go into the details, but and there are many references, but take a look at my dimension 1. I found that the two areas separating the language of aeronautical communication across different domains could be identified as polite marker, addressee focused discourse, language with high information density, compared with spoken language that's focusing more on involved production, and more narrative kind of markers in the language, right? So if I utilize this multidimensional factor in this one result, you comparing some of the data that I have, here's a quick comparison of my output, comparing 7 different registers. My global aviation is in the middle with a dimension score of about 2.211. Call center communication is above there. So, very polite, very elaborated, addressee focused discourse. Biber defined addressee focus as when you speak a language where your utterances refer to the person you're talking with. So a lot of pronouns, a lot of especially second person pronoun you. You may have to do this. You have to change this, something like that, right? And so if you take a look at my 3 target radio or telephone-based registers, they're up there, right? Addressee, focus, polite, and elaborated information. The other ones at the bottom are discourse or registers that were collected in the United States with primarily native speakers of English as main interlocutors. U.S. workplaces, U.S. healthcare, U.S. AAC, non-AAC workplace corpus, and then language in academia. There were some international teaching assistants in this domain based on what I collected, but they're all based in the U.S. So in this politeness domain, if you may, it separated the more task-oriented telephone-based registers of call centers, global aviation, and maritime industry. So something, if I'm going into the macro comparison, I feel like there's something in here. If you guys remember my iterative cycle earlier, this will tell me that, hey, go deeper in here. Go deeper into the analyses because there's some interesting pattern that might tell you something is going on, right? So if I go deeper into the next level, and I just compare the language of some pilots from the sub-corpora that I've collected, the call center Indian and Filipino agents, and the people they're talking with, I get this type of distribution. The Southeast Asian pilots, most of them coming from the Philippines and Malaysia. The Chinese pilots are way up on the positive end of this continuum. The South American pilots, many of them from Brazil, are in the middle. And then the US pilots are at the bottom, but if I color coded them, it's still green. So the pilots here are in this positive end of the MDA continuum. They're very, very different from those at the bottom, where the language of US air traffic controllers and the language of US pilot trainees are also located. So if I isolate this further into just the pilots, this is what I have. So in terms of the use of these preferred, again, I'm calling addressee focused, polite, and elaborated information as identified by the co-occurrence of those features that I showed you earlier. The language of Southeast Asian pilots, Chinese, South American, and even the US pilots are closer to 0 than to 2, but they're on the positive side of this continuum, right? The trainees are on the opposite side, compared to these professional pilots, which tells me that the trainees are listening to what they're taking at school. Remember, I told you earlier that in terms of what the micro policy, in terms of what the textbooks are saying, the pilot trainees need to disregard, or politeness features are not encouraged. They should actually focus on direct language. They should focus on more specific phraseology, avoid even respect markers like sir. But then in reality, if you look at the language of the professionals, they use it a lot. So something is going on there where we can now argue in terms of policy. And then later on, in terms of teaching, how we could potentially interact with the policymakers and then the textbook writers in terms of how we could improve this maybe, because this is not how the professionals are utilizing the actual language, on the job, right? Compared to how the pilots are, the student pilots are utilizing what they learn while they're practicing, while they're doing simulations, or when they're actually working on their first few sets of guided flights themselves. One thing that's really fascinating is that the language of US air traffic controllers is very, very different from the language of pilots. So again, there's another area there where we can take a look at, wow, the distributions, the directions, the information coming from the controllers linguistically are very, very different from the language of the pilot. So again, big sign there that we have to further analyze what's going on, right? So one summary in this domain is something along the lines of, if the International Civil Aviation Organization, based on the guidance of the United Nations, if they're saying again that politeness is not an important component of the language of aeronautical communication, but then that's what we see practiced in the real world, then there is a mismatch. You know, we have to fix that. And again, that's something coming from a linguist. I'm going to play with you. Some of you who have heard me present this may have heard this presentation. This is not private. This is publicly available data. And I wanted you guys to pay attention to how the interlocutors, both the airline, the air traffic controller, and the different pilots, there are two sets of pilots in this interaction. One group of pilots from Etihad talking with a JFK or New York JFK airport air traffic controller, and take a listen to the value that the pilots emphasized related to polite language and polite markers in this interaction.
Echo in the Echo Tank at 503. Where do you park?
Bravo 28, sir.
What taxiway, the letter?
Oh, negative, sir. We're on 22 right, holding short of Foxtrot.
What taxiway do you enter the ramp?
Okay, sir. We just exited the runway and we're holding short of Foxtrot on 22 right.
You're not listening to what I'm asking you. What taxiway do you enter the ramp?
I'm not on the ramp yet, sir.
What taxiway do you enter the ramp? Tell me. What letter?
Okay, we can enter at Kilo for Etihad 503.
That's what I need to get out of you. We talked like 6 times. Straight ahead and hold shut of hotel, sir.
Straight ahead, hold short of hotel, right?
Asiana 222, turn right here, turn left onto 22 right and hold short of Juliet. Asiana 222.
Go ahead.
Turn right, left onto 22 right, hold short of Juliet.
Okay, right turn, then a 22 light, holding short, Juliet, Asiana 222.
ETD 503, follow Asiana at Golf, hold short of Juliet on the runway.
Yes, sir, we follow the Asiana, and next time I would like you to be polite with me. Thank you.
Okay, but if I got to talk to you 6 times and I got other people I got to talk to, and you don't understand what I'm saying.
You understand what I'm saying? Polite with me, all right?
You want polite with me?
I'll make a report.
Go ahead.
All right, I hope everybody heard that. Peter, could you give me a thumbs up if the sound was okay?
Yeah, we're all good, Eric.
All right, good. So in terms of really, again, in terms of both policy applications and then at the same time potential teaching, I feel like there is something that we have to further investigate. Really, if the textbooks are saying politeness doesn't help, politeness is indirect, right? And all these markers do not aid, in terms of the describing the important features of useful communication in aeronautical communication, then we gotta take a look at but in reality, that's not what the pilots and the air traffic controllers are doing. And again, what the preference of the Etihad pilot about, treating me nicely. This is my work, so I hope you'll be polite with me. There's something deeper there, right? There's something very important to recognize, that language is not necessarily just for directness and get it all done, and because it's still part of work. However, I do not want to minimize safety. Safety is very, very important. And if you are obviously worried about safety in flight, well, don't worry, because it has been a really, really, really safe industry. So just make sure that you guys should not really worry about these things. In fact, planes can practically fly themselves nowadays. Obviously, pilots are still needed. I don't also want to overemphasize that too. All right. Next type of analyses that I want to share with you today is how do we further use Corpora in describing the register of aeronautical communication? My colleague Marcus Wieswanger from Germany demonstrated that the varieties of speech in aviation or aeronautical communication could be categorized as standard phraseology. This in the industry or in the field, SP has been referred to. That's what pilots and ATCs will have to memorize. They have to be drilled in memorizing the language. You know, they have to know it by heart, basically. And then there's plain aviation English, right? So many people from the very beginning of this type of discourses really felt like, oh, it's just one kind of communicative domain, right? But it really is something separate, right? So articulating what is standard phraseology and what is plain aviation English has been very important. And this is where Corpora have been utilized really well. You know, we were able to articulate really what is typical communication, if you may, plain aviation, and what really is standard phraseology. And this has direct applications to teaching. Lots of materials developed following phraseology that is useful for a lot of pilots, both native and non-native. However, something that's very important is the divide between non-native speakers versus native speakers, if you may, or L1 or L2 speakers. People make a big deal out of these things, but if you take a look at standard versus plain language, that even native speakers will have some sort of like a big challenge in really navigating both, as illustrated by this short clip. Both pilots and air traffic controllers are native speakers of English in this clip. But take a look at potential misunderstanding in how one standard language, standard phraseology is utilized, and how when there was an issue, plain language became the default.
Tower FedEx 3745 Heavy is on the ILS, 25 left, is low window 180.
25 Heavy, LA, runway 25 left, correct line. Number 2, following Company Heavy, Airbus 38 mile final.
Okay, number 2. Clear to land.
FedEx 3745 Heavy, number 1, runway 25 left, line, caution, right turbulence.
Okay, and understand we're clear to land. America 135 Heavy, Honda.
America 135 Heavy, LA, Tower, continue.
Continue. And Tower FedEx 3745, understand clear to land.
FedEx 3745 Heavy, this is like a third clearance I'm issuing there. How do you hear me?
I hear you fine. You said number 1. You never said cleared to land.
Okay, I did every single time. FedEx 3745 Heavy, number 1, wind 260 runway 25 left, to land.
Clear to land, 25 left, 3745.
It's a fascinating interaction when it comes to you know, how the air traffic controller was phrasing or articulating clear to land in this context. And the pilot did not hear it, although the ATC actually, and he was right, he said it multiple times. But if you're just a casual listener, you feel like, oh, I don't understand what he actually said there. And so that's where in radio telephony and in phraseology and aviation English, we can take a look at some of these patterns and the questioning of how people have defined plain language versus standard phraseology. What were the textbooks saying and what we have to learn if you're an ATC or if you're a pilot. And then again, at the same time, how do you navigate all of these things when there are potential miscommunication, right? So you switch from standard phraseology to plain language, and now you're looking at you know, further clarifying. And so again, the critique that I'm sharing here is the reliance on teach only standard phraseology, you know, teach only aviation phraseology in this context. But in reality, when you go to corpus-based data, you're finding out that there are mismatches. There are some of these areas where the speakers actually may deviate a lot, both native and non-native. And so we can not only just focus on how the L1 or not L2 speakers in this domain, particularly non-native speaking pilots, are utilizing something outside of standard phraseology when even the native speakers are like that as well, right? So we need to convince our textbook writers and our ICAO policymakers and many of our universities to take a look at the real world data that Corpora could provide us. And as you can see, corpus data, 68% of information about flight level, an area in phraseology, has been done with non-standard phraseology. Although again, the instruction is it has to be based on standard phraseology. Again, I've mentioned the works of my colleagues from Brazil, especially Patricia. She's done a lot when it comes to identifying particular words and how they are actually utilized in terms of really both the application and the prescription, if you may, in terms of the manual of radio telephony. And so this is where, again, important and very, very useful corpus-based data could provide us with real-world examples that we can actually take into the classroom and say, this is how it's used, this is how many speakers are utilizing this, and so this is how we should best teach these kinds of information. This data from Swinehart as well from 2013, taken from the Corpus Cockpit Voice Recording from National Transportation Safety Board, or NTSB, with about 66,800 words. This is accessible. You guys can take a look at this corpus and take a look again at some potential usage in a similar domain. I'm going to end with last two examples of how we can utilize corpus-based ideas, tools, and data in pedagogy and in research as well. I worked with Jennifer Roberts in focusing on materials design, and we have a 2022 book chapter from an edited volume by Jablonka and Some, the Routledge Handbook of Corpora and Language Teaching and Learning. And we presented a couple of examples of materials design for aviation instruction that utilizes data from Corpora. And in those examples, we ended with a few more research questions. So we ended our chapter with more questions about what could we do, for teachers like us, what else could we do, right? And here are some of the items that we identified. Number one, what are the differences between radio telephony used in ab initio, or student pilots, flight training, radio telephony, and commercial flight? So again, student versus professional pilots. As you can see from my data earlier, the student pilots were using language that were slightly different from the professional ones, right? And I guess it's self-explanatory. The student pilots follow the rules. They are drilled. They listen to their advisors or their teachers, and they follow what they have to do, to show that they understood the instruction, to show that they studied, right? But yeah, we're finding out that their language is different from the actual language of those who are professional already. How can corpus research illustrate the use of less frequent but highly valuable language used in non-routine radio communication? Right? This is a big question, but difficult, because we need more data. We need more texts. We need to collect many of these less frequent and also non-routine radio communication. And Malila Prado has done some work in these types of corpora, or specialized corpora. There have been works by Aline Pacheco, also from Brazil, that looked at primarily problematic interaction, where there are potential miscommunication or potential accident happening, and collecting that language, collecting those sample texts, also very important in looking at how do people react when it's a problematic, potentially dangerous kind of interaction. It could be weather related, or it could be something happening with the airplane. And so what are speakers doing at that point? What are characteristics of the language used during emergency? That's something related to what I just said. And what vocabulary load or coverage is required for ATC, or air traffic controller communication in emergencies as well. So we focus on pilots, but obviously we have to take a look at the language of air traffic controllers globally as well. And that's another area that's fascinating because as shown by my data earlier, the language of ATCs is really very, very different from the language of the pilots themselves in terms of linguistic occurrences and the characteristic discourse, characteristic focus, and even the functions of what they show in terms of their linguistic distributions. My students, Andy Schneider and Rachel Udell from Georgia State University and also from Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University have collected a specialized corpus called CFT, or Corpus of Flight Training. They recorded recorded actual interaction, training interaction between a student pilot and the teacher while performing flight activities. And the interactions are really fascinating. Andy Schneider has been working on this as also part of his big dissertation work. And it's really fascinating how we can learn a lot from the language of student pilots. What are they asking? How are they repeating or performing what their teachers are telling them to do? And so again, very fascinating. I hope that a paper coming out of this CFT corpus will be published soon. So Schneider and Udell asked us also similar kinds of questions. So what are situational factors that influence spoken interactions between flight students and flight instructors? What are the linguistic features that characterize the spoken language used in flight training? How does language function in the various stages of flight? And are there distinctive differences between these stages? How does the language of flight training compare with other spoken registers, such as conversation English, academic conversation, professional aviation English, etc., etc.? And this is very, very promising. The main problem that Andy and Rochelle have experienced, obviously, is the difficulty in collecting this data. It calls for a lot of time. It calls for extended recording of hours and hours of flight training. Transcription is very, very difficult, and it's a lot of work. It's a lot of work. They have done quite a bit already, but it definitely is a lot of work, but it's very, very promising. And again, there is a paper in preparation, so I hope it'll come out sometime in the next year or so. So I'm going to wrap up this presentation. I hope that I was able to kind of give you some ideas of what we're doing in this domain. And if you are not in this particular domain, you're working with professional communication, I hope that there are some takeaways that you can apply to your own fields of study. I'm continuing to describe the cross-cultural features and characteristic features and distributions of aviation English. That's a goal. And I would like to also just really not focus just on aviation, pilot and air traffic controller, but also with other things like maintenance manual, especially with the written side of aviation English, technical MROs or manuals utilized for the maintenance of airplanes. I want to understand further the register variation that's within the subdisciplines and subregisters of these domains. I wanted to look further into some sociolinguistic variables such as power, identities of speakers in various task-based communicative domains. Again, who has the power between an ATC and a pilot, when there are issues or problems, right? How is the language intimidation factor playing a role in potential miscommunication? Particularly if one group of speakers could be intimidated by the linguistic characteristics of the spoken discourse of a native speaker, right? So something to further analyze and explore in these areas. So what are practical and more pedagogical implications? How to develop training materials? What are macro policy implications of results, etc., etc. I wanted to end by looping back at what I said earlier about assessment. I mentioned the International Civil Aviation Organization, where there is a prescribed language policy or language proficiency requirement, so what we call LPRs, where if you are a non-native English speaker, if you are an international pilot, you have to show what they call an operational level 4, which is the minimum level acceptable to ensure safe operations. Again, this is according to the United Nations ICAO. This is an area where we need your help. We need applied linguists, we need language teachers, because this is not clear and it is potentially problematic because there is no clear way to implement this globally. Different countries, different airlines may have different ways in quote unquote policing their international pilots. And it's an area where we better, we got to be better. We got to have a certain level of clear assessment, articulation and criteria. We need a better way of global monitoring and comparison. And ultimately, we need all of the assessment experts out there to help in further discussing how we could make this better. So with that, thank you all for joining me today. Thanks again to Peter and to Fran for the invitation. And I hope you guys will enjoy the rest of your evening or day. Thank you again.
Thank you, Eric. A really interesting talk on a really kind of unique and fascinating area of corpus linguistics. We've had a couple of questions in the chat that we'll go into. For those of you who are, I don't know if the people in the audience are kind of more or less afraid of flying now than they were at the beginning of the talk.
I hope not.
I mean, you think about how many flights conducted daily around the world and how many of those are, kind of result in near misses due to poor communication or issue, that kind of thing. You never know, right? So that's a little bit of an issue, I suppose. So I got a couple of questions myself. Maybe I'll just lead off with the questions, and it's about the nature of the data that you work with is highly dialogic, and I'm wondering if you could maybe explain a little bit about how you were able to combine this really dialogue where things like the pauses and overlap and things like that are so important, and how you manage that through a corpus approach where you don't tend to see in the data, or at least the concordances or the tools that are used might not take a lot of that into account during the analysis. So how do you balance the type of data that you're doing with a corpus-based approach?
That's a good question, Peter. And again, a little bit of like when we say we're dealing with spoken corpora, right? That's always going to be a challenge when it comes to our, just really including all sorts of variables that you feel you can utilize. Based on my model earlier, I'm able to just really focus on the more traditional text-driven type analyses first, right? So the transcription will help me first. So I start with the transcription. I start with different types of segmentation, for example, right? So, easy way to separate the language of pilot and then the language of their interlocutor. So, if it's ATC versus pilots, depending on how I extracted the data from what I collected, I can start by segmenting, so I will have the text type, text-based corpus, no sound, no particular phonology or suprasegmental features, but I'm making sure to include some of these disfluent markers. So for example, field pauses, because they're very, very important. So I include all of these things, and many of them are done manually. So, I've had students who will painstakingly listen and incorporate all of these pauses, and even definitely putting in markers for how long was the pausing, right? Because it's very important given that this is radio, right? So the radio telephony side of it. So starting with that, But then later on, because pronunciation, especially if it's L1, L2 type comparison, right? The non-native versus native comparison, then I try to incorporate other markers. So that's where I go into combining data from FRAT or ALON, in terms of other measures. And then I have actually incorporated some of those in a multidimensional analysis type of research, where some of them are jumping out as a potential characteristic of one discourse domain, So it's a lot of a combination of manual annotation, because that's where we are so far. We still don't have a lot of these automatic taggers for phraseology and phonetic features. But there are some really, really good tools nowadays that immediately will help us with transcription. So it's a good start.
Thanks for that, Eric. We did actually have a question about some of the specific tools that you might use to do that.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of some of the tools for the traditional corpus part of speech tagging, that kind of stuff, I've utilized all of the Viber type tools. I've studied with Doug Viber, so I've developed my own set of tools as well. But yeah, part of speech tagging, there are many programs nowadays in terms of transcription, text to voice type, voice to text type things that you can download easily. And then some of my annotation, I'm a big fan of in vivo. So, in terms of the manual annotation that I will ask my students or my postdoc students in helping me annotate some of the features, then I combine all of those tools as well.
Yeah, it's pretty painstaking work. I fully appreciate the level of detail, but as you said, it's about once you got those initial findings, how are you then digging down deeper and deeper into the analyses, and we can get an insight from your answer there about how you're doing that exactly. So that's really useful information for us.
Yeah, and I just wanted to, because I mentioned, Peter, the study on politeness, right? So this whole idea, and I gotta be careful about this because I'm oversimplifying what politeness is, right? But really it begins, and this is a limitation with our corpus approach. So for example, you can capture frequencies of grammatical politeness, if you may. How many pleases, how many could I, or may I, or thank you, or thanks, or I appreciate, all of those things. We can start by, counting them and putting them there, but are they really polite? The whole point. I've been criticized about this, why are you saying that that's politeness when you don't really know, right? But I say, hey, I agree, but that is how we do these types of things. You begin with extracting data, extracting patterns, but you don't stop there. That's why for me, my approach is really, it's mixed methods, right? So you begin with quantitative, right? You start with numbers, you start with frequency, but I'm not rejecting or not neglecting the important contributions of more qualitative, more in-depth analyses. And that is where all of the checking will happen. All of the additional, this could be categorized as polite discourse because of the tone, because of the implications about what was said in here.
That's great. That's super useful, Eric. I've actually got a talk coming up next month on mixed methods research in Corpora, so I'm going to steal that right there and use it as an example. And that's actually at EDU HK, Small World, right? So yeah, I've got a question come from our Paula, of course, and who asks about actions and policies have been taken to bridge communication between linguists and air traffic stakeholders in order to solve miscommunication based on the data that you've shown us?
There have been, through the United Nations, which basically is our mother organization in monitoring and analyzing what's happening and ensuring that language is, or if there are miscommunication, language needs are addressed. In some of these areas, there are many language accident investigators. There's an area called human factors in aviation, where language could be incorporated or included. It's really fascinating. The human factors may include also a pilot being tired. And so is it really language, or is it the pilot just tired, or the pilot had too much to drink basically in between flights, right? So but there are linguists, and my colleague Elizabeth Matthews was one of the influential linguists from the International Civil Aviation Organization, and so she has been very vocal in incorporating the perspectives of applied linguists and sociolinguists and intercultural communication experts, because that is the policy. I hope I'm not offending ICAO members when I say that, it has been dominated by native speaker English speakers from the very beginning. It has been dominated by the preference for one type of language. The whole idea is that English has to be the official language of aviation, that especially for international flights, that even when you're communicating with another Brazilian and you're a Brazilian pilot, English has to be the default language. And so there is that. And again, for us in applied linguistics and in policy, we may want to question that, but again, I'm too far away from even getting into a debate or an opportunity to discuss something like that. But it's happening, and I'm happy really that in many of the ICAO, International Civil Aviation English Association meetings, ICAO members have always been represented, and we hear from them, and it's good to keep the communication lines open.
Yeah, it's really good that you have kind of champions for applied linguists who are engaging with these bodies, and I hope that answers your question, Paula. Got a technical question from Mustafa, who asks, how do you define a lexical unit in aviation English? Is it lemmas, types, tokens, or what are you basing it on?
It's a combination of both, in depending on what I'm doing, depending on the particular question. So I've done both. In terms of the multidimensional analyses, they're more based on the tagging, based on what I have obtained from the part of speech tagger. So it could be a lemma, it could be just a particular unit. And I also will incorporate, for example, again, if I mention, I may have a tag for pronouns, for all pronouns, but then I may have separate tags for, first person, second person. And that's why if you guys were looking at the distributions in my multidimensional analyses, second person pronouns separated from other types of pronouns, because really the use of you, you have to change this. So both, especially the ATC, the use of you referring to the pilot. So in that case, it could be both, and I move from one to another in terms of the definition.
Thanks, Eric. Another question from Fatma related to tips for building Corpora from professional settings. In particular, how do we get permission to access this kind of data, for example?
Yeah, it's always going to be a big challenge for us. With the ATC and pilot communication, I mentioned to you, there's a YouTube channel. This is a fascinating thing, Peter, because it's actually freely available. There will be freely available. They're already recorded. So you guys are all familiar with various regulating bodies. You're all familiar with, the black boxes in airplanes, especially when we hear about the black boxes when something bad happens, right? But all these interactions are actually recorded. There are online venues, people downloading them and sharing. In fact, some of them are already transcribed even, When I started collecting this, it was more sound files that I was collecting from YouTube. And I had a couple of research assistants who I asked to help me transcribe them, So many of these pilot ATC communication, you have access to them, you can download them. But if the question was about other areas and other domains like doctor-patient interaction or workplace interaction, it's really, really difficult. Sometimes access is the biggest issue. When I collected my call center data, I collected interactions using the telephone with companies that are serving American callers, both in India and based in India and the Philippines. I had to go through a very, very, very strict legal set of documents, practically telling me that if I violate something, I'll be sent to jail, you know. But because I really had to have the data, and you know that was in fact my dissertation, and so I signed up. You know, I wanted to make sure that, hey, I'll ensure privacy and confidentiality. I'll make sure that something like this is not going to be easily available. So that's another limitation. Many of the data, except for the aviation one, but many of the data that I have, you know, cannot be shared. You know, I cannot share it with you guys for a triangulation or, you know, another set of analyses, because many of these companies are not going to allow me to share them, right? But there are some that are available. So please go check out the Hong Kong corpus of spoken English from our website. Many of those data you can actually immediately just download, and they're freely available.
Thanks, Eric. We got time for just one more question. This is from Noble. This kind of goes back to something that you already mentioned with relation to analyzing sound files. And this is about, well, thinking about politeness in terms of tone. Does tone matter and how do you deal with that in your analyses?
Yeah, it does really, and again, I've addressed it in stages, you know. So I could start with Biber used the term grammatical politeness, just to get a, you know, lexical politeness as well. You know, it's just basically the word please is polite, period, right? Just because you know the basic reason why you will say please compared to not saying it, right? So the presence of please may indicate politeness, right? So we can start there. That's a good start, you know, because if I say, all right, there are two speakers, one Eric and the other one Peter. You know, they spoke for an hour. Peter had, you know, 20 politeness markers per 1,000 words. Eric has 100 politeness markers per 1,000 words, right? I mean, arguably, we can say, oh, Eric, you preferred all of these features more than Peter, right? So if I interpret that qualitatively, I might say Eric is more polite than Peter, right? All right, is that good? Maybe not, because you know, we need to find out. We need to go and analyze the data some more and see what happens. And that's where the second stage will come in for me. You know, that's where if I have access to the sound files, then I will randomly select from all of these occurrences of please from Peter and Eric, maybe 10 from Peter and 10 from Eric, randomly selected, and then make a judgment, really. How many of these 10 occurrences randomly selected I could interpret as really polite versus an expression of, you know, just a lexical politeness marker. So that is one way. So this is where, again, the need to go deeper and need to do the qualitative interpretive. If you have the sounds associated with your recordings, then good for you, you know, because that's that can add potential evidence as well. Other people, you know, not in aviation, but the works of Shelley Staples in analyzing the language of patients and nurses, you know, in an interaction, in kind of like a difficult sharing of illness or diagnoses in a hospital setting, where she recorded and analyzed the language of foreign educated nurses and nurses who are based in the United States. And she uses spectrographic displays to indicate tone, intonation patterns, and analyze, you know, what she could interpret as maybe a more polite way in talking with a patient from an American nurse compared to a foreign educated nurse being misinterpreted by the US-based patient, and maybe even saying, oh, you sound so rude, you know, in terms of the tone, in terms of the sound, and just arguing that, oh, you can see that it's the fluctuating spectrographic display that could argue for what the potential patient was interpreting as potentially rude, you know, according to her or his interpretation of the tone.
Again, that's another fantastic example of really mixed methods, corpus linguistic research.
Yeah.
Thanks so much, Eric. We've reached the end of our time for today. It's been wonderful to have you on. It's been an absolutely fascinating talk. The audience has put in lots of messages into the chat, congratulating you on a wonderful presentation. So let's thank our speaker again one more time before we finish up for today. Thanks so much, Eric. just going to very quickly share the details of next week's talk. Again, we are on a Thursday, the 10th of November this time, and we're going to be having Dr. Luciana Forti from the University for Foreigners of Perugia, Italy, and she's going to be looking at integrating second language acquisition evidence into DDL effects-oriented research. So do tune in for that next Thursday. We look forward to seeing as many of you there as possible. But in the meantime, let's thank our speaker again, Eric, and wish him all the best. And we're going to finish the recording here and wish everybody a pleasant evening or day wherever you're at. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.